Hello, my name is Lance Finney. I'm a software developer with Oasis Digital, a consulting company in St. Louis. We mostly do Angular code, but other work as well. And I'm an instructor with Angular Bootcamp. I'm going to be talking about transposing rows and columns in AG Grid. If you've ever run into a grid that you want to have showing data that's not the default way, this might be a useful talk for you. Most grids, like Excel or AG Grid or whatever, most grids are displayed in such a way so that the columns are all of a certain type, and then the rows give different data, like a different record for each of that type. So for example, if we had a loan tracking spreadsheet, you might have a column for the date that a payment is made, and then a column for the amount of the payment, a column for the amount of the interest accrued in the previous month, a column for the amount of the principal that will be paid off in that month, etc. So you'll have each row looking like the same type of data, and each column defining what the data looks like on there. So the first column, that date column, will be rendered to look like a date. The second column will be rendered to look like a currency, etc. That is the typical way of doing things. But sometimes we run into things where we want to have that swapped, where we want to have the rendering and the editing and everything else be consistent across a row and our data to be defined in a column. It doesn't happen much, but sometimes we need it. AG Grid is one of the most powerful grid libraries for Angular and other frameworks, just web development in general. And it doesn't support that out of the box. But the tools that it gives us allow us to do it if we add some extra code. And that code is what I'm going to be talking about here. So this is the app that I'm going to be using to talk through this. It's something that I put together. I've released it on GitHub, so I'll show that later. Imagining that we are working on a prototype for an app where we're seeing what languages, what names are in different languages. So for example, we have Eugene in English, and there's a Spanish version of that, Eugenio, a German version, Eugen, a Russian version, Yevgeny. So we have 4 different languages, 6 different names that we can put on here, names that go across these different cultures. My name, Lance, it wouldn't work on here. It's English only. It doesn't translate. But these are names that exist all throughout Europe, and so I can do that here. So that's what I'm going to do here. Now, that's the starting point. Later on, I'm going to add some greetings, so it gets a little more complicated. So I have some rendering on each column. And then by the end, we're going to have it swapped so that what had been rows are now columns and what had been columns are now rows. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's look first at how this is defined. So I look at my code here, and this is the simple component. This is the definition I have for that particular tab. The template file is pretty simple. It just has a use of the AG grid using the Angular version of it. I use a class so that I can define the theme to look like an Angular material app. And then the core part of this, the only part that truly matters for what we're talking about, is how we pass our data into the grid. An AG grid expects data in 2 forms. The row data is the definition of what actually appears within the grid. Eugene, Maria, Matois, Barbara, all of that. That is defined in the row data. The column defs defines a configuration, the definition of the configuration for each column. So it's what defines what the header is, how things look, if there's any editors, all of those things. They are defined by default per column. So that's great when we have our data like this, where I have the same data in each column. But I'm going to get to a point where I want to have, say, different renderers in different rows on the same column. So that's what we're going to be building to. Now, the way that we do this for our simple data is we start out with this component. To get our row data in, I'm going to use an array. I'm getting it from a service here to a little bit mock out as we were getting this from the back end. It's not really mocking that out, but just showing that this data would usually not be hard-coded into our components. We'd be getting it from somewhere. So in this particular case, the contents of our table are defined in this array. So for each name, we have an English, Spanish, German, and Russian version of it. That is what appears right here, English, Spanish, German, and Russian for each name. So each of these are defined with a property as a lowercase version of the name of the language, and then the value of that property is the name in that language. And that is what we show for our row data. For our column definitions, we have our header at the top. That's the English, Spanish, German, Russian. And then the field is the property name that AGGrid uses to grab its values out of these rows. And this is a simple version. This is all we're doing here. So let's make it a little more complicated. As I hinted before, we're going to have greetings. So in English, we're going to change this so that we say hello Eugene, hello Mary, and so on. In Spanish, we'll say hola Mateo, hola Barbara. In German, we'll say guten Tag Johann, guten Tag Martha, etc. Now, I'm not adding hello to the backing data. I'm going to be doing that through a renderer. So let's see how that works. Now, the row data is the same. As I said, I'm not adding it. I'm using the exact same row data. I'm doing all of this through rendering. So in addition to the header name and the field that I had previously, I'm now adding a cell renderer. There are several different ways that you can do cell renderers in AGGrid. They have a page that talks about quite a few different approaches. We're going to use the function approach, that we are defining the cell renderer property to be a function that returns a string that it can display. So we are defining this function for each of our columns that takes the params object, and this is something that comes from AGGrid. It gives us for this callback that has the value of it and a few other things. And then we are going to return from it something that will render that column. So now for each cell within that column, it will get to this point and it will call this function to render it. It will pass in the parameters, and then it will get hello and the param name, or hola and the param value, and guten Tag and the param value, and privyet and the param value. So we are using these cell renderers to define how things appear on the screen. So this is a basic approach. This is a start. I don't quite like it. It's because this is really duplicating code. You may have noticed over here in the service, I have an array of the languages where I can put the name of the language and the greeting together. Let's make use of that, because this will be more realistic. In most applications, if we wanted to add Italian or French or whatever, we wouldn't want to have to change the code like this. We would change it on the back end and hope that our code could handle it cleanly. So let's do that. Instead of hard coding these for each languages, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this array from the service, and then I'll map over it. Map is a function on an array that will convert each value of that array to something else. So I will take in each language, and a language is defined as something that has this name and a greeting, and I'm going to return an object that has a header name, a field, and a cell renderer. So the header name for each column is going to be the language name. So I'm going to have English, Spanish, German, and Russian. The field name, which remember is the property that we use to grab the value out of the row, is going to be that same name but converted to lowercase. And the cell renderer is going to be the same thing that we did before, except instead of hard coding the greeting, I'm going to grab that out of the language. So I'm going to grab privyet, guten Tag, hola, and hello out of it like you would need to. And the result of this is some code that is not specific to the languages that we have. So we are creating a renderer that is more generic. We are creating a renderer that works well right here. So we have our renderer. So great. That's as far as we've gotten. We still have everything done in the fairly normal way. But now our manager has thrown us for a loop. What they want us to do is to transpose it. What they really want by the end is to have it look like this. Instead of having a column for each language and a row for each name, they want that swapped. So the header is now English, and then each row is another language, and then each column is the name. So we can have John as the header, and Hola Juan, Guten Tag Johann, and Privyet Ivan as the parts of that column. Well, that's going to get kind of complicated, especially since, as I just pointed out, the renderers are done per column, but now I'm rendering differently on each row. Let's get to that in a bit. Let's start simple. Let's start with just looking at what it takes to transpose the data. So pull up this component. I'll also let you know the HTML is slightly different here. In order to make things work a little bit with this different way of doing the columns, I added one thing. I'll explain why in a moment. But otherwise, everything's the same. And this is the form for all the different versions that I have from now on. So what I've done here in this first version is I've hard-coded the values just so we can see what our goal is. I don't want this to be the final version. I want all these values to be generated dynamically off these values so that if we get new names added from the back end, or if we get new languages, that we don't have to do anything in our front end to handle those. But just to start, I wrote this just so we can see what a structure would be. So a hard-coded structure would be, our row is we have a language value for Spanish, and then a property for each of the names with the translations in Spanish. Similar, a property for, to say the name is German, and then a property for each of the names. And that is how we populate here: Spanish through Marta, German through Marta, etc. Now our column defs will be a little bit different. We're going to have a special column just for the header. So I don't want it to have anything at the top, so it doesn't have a header value. The field is going to be language, so that's going to let us grab the Russian out of here. I gave it a cell style just to be a little bit bigger, just to pop out, and then I pin it to the left. And the advantage of pinning it to the left is that if this is small enough that there's a scroll bar, it's not included. And that is why I added that suppress movable columns here. It wouldn't make sense to have this set up and then being able to grab Eugene and then drag it over in front of there. And then what does that even mean? Things would look weird. So I just added that one thing just for that one particular case. But anyway, we have this transpose. Now that I've done that, I guess I only talked about this one. In addition to that column, I'm going to have a column for each of the names. So I'll have a column for Eugene, a column for Mary, a column for Matthew, where the header is going to be the name capitalized as we normally expect, and the field is going to be lowercase to match what we have up here. So now, just as before, where we use the field name to pull the values out of that array, I'm going to do the exact same thing here. So this is the structure that we're going to build to. But as I said, I don't want to have it hard code like that. I don't want to repeat myself. And that's what I'm doing a lot here. So I'm going to go now to the transpose dry, where I don't repeat myself. Dry stands for don't repeat yourself. It's a principle to keep in mind with programming. So let's take a look at how that one worked. So this now looks a lot more complicated. It's not hard-coded, but there's conversion code here. It takes a little bit more to think about, but the advantage is that it is generic. So we're now creating our row data, and remember, it's going to look at the end like this. We're creating our row data dynamically. So the number of rows that we have is going to be the number of languages minus 1, because we're not doing a row for English. That's actually being thrown up to the header. So the easy thing to do is let's start with this array. So if our server starts giving us new values here, that's the same array that we'll be working on. So then for every row, we're going to create a new value from it. First, we do a filter. This call on filter is a function on the array where I'm saying, all right, I don't care about the property or the value of that element, but if the index of that element is 0, don't include it. I just want to skip the English one. I want to have a row for everything else besides the English one. So after that filter is done, I'm left with an array that's like this. And I want to convert it, as you remember, to an array that looks like this. So first, I add this first property, the language property. So I create an object, I'm calling it lang values, that has that one property. I'm calling it language, and we grab the language name out of that array. Now I'm going to need another property on here for each element in this array. So I'm going to add a property for Eugene, a property for Mary, a property for Matthew, etc. So I have that array up here, and I iterate over that array, and for each value in that array, I add a new property. The property name is going to be the English version, lowercase, and the value is going to be extracted out of here. So when I'm doing the Spanish row, I'm going to extract the Spanish property out of this element to be Eugenio and Maria, Mateo, etc. So this creates all of the properties here besides the one special one I created. So now I have my row data in the form that I want. And I'm doing it in a way that it will be flexible if there are changes to the data that the server gives me. So that's how I'm doing the row data. Now I need to create my column defs. Now again, there's a special column def at the beginning, and then one column def for each name translation. The way I do that is I create an array of column defs, and I have that special one at the front. And then for each name translation, for each element in this array, I convert it to the form that I want. So I start out, I'll start out with Eugene, and then Mary and Matthew, Barbara, John, etc. So my header name is now the English version of that name. As you remember, Eugene, Mary, Matthew, Barbara, John, Martha. So my header in each case is going to be the English value. That's what this grabs. And the field is going to be that name converted to lowercase so that it can be pulled out right there. So that is how we end up with this version. We are transposed and we are flexible. Now, what we've forgotten though, what we left behind, is the greeting. We need to have our renderers back. Now, again, this is going to be a little bit tricky because renderers are defined on a column, but now I'm having the rendering be the same on each row. How do we do that? So the first version I'm going to look at of this goes back to the hard-coded. Just I don't want to focus on adding all the concepts at once. So this is built on that transposed greeting. The final version is going to merge the things together. So the data behind it doesn't change at all. Again, it's just rendering. It's not the actual data. What's going to change here is the column defs. So I'll pull up over here what we used before. Move it over there. So this is what we used before for our renderer. We took the params and we grabbed the language, the greeting out of the language, and we grabbed the value out of the params. And that's what we're going to end up doing here. The thing is, I was able to use the language previously because I was iterating over languages. I'm not iterating over languages. Well, this is the hard-coded version. I'm not iterating over anything. But I will be iterating over the names, not the languages. But I can still get to them. So I grab the languages array up top, and then I want to get the individual language out. And I can do that because params gives us something very important. It gives us the row index. So each time this is called for each cell, we get from the params two things that are important. The value that would normally be displayed there, and the index of the row that we are currently on. So I can use that row index to pull the language out and pull the greeting from that language. So in this particular case, because I'm skipping English, I need to add 1. So when I'm grabbing it for this, for Hola Maria, it gets a row index of 0. That's the value here. So then I grab the language, number 1, get Spanish, and then I grab Hola out of it, and I can say Hola Maria. So this is how you can do it, to have your renderers look like they are per row by taking the params value and doing different logic on each row. So then, Hola Maria, Guten Tag Maria, Privyet Maria, because in each case it's getting a different row index and it is grabbing a different value out of here to present it. So we have what we need. This looks like what the user wants, but I'm not happy with this code. Now, part of it is that this is really verbose, and if I were hard coding it like this, there's a lot of duplication. But I'm not going to be doing that. As you saw before in the not repeating myself version, it's going to be dynamically created. But even with that, I don't like it because it's not really well testable. There's enough logic here that I want to have a unit test built on this. But it would be hard to test for 2 reasons. The lesser important reason, in my opinion, is that it's hard to actually get to that function because this function is just going to be embedded in a column def. So to test this, I would have to say component, give me the column defs, give me element 1, 2, 3, or do I test them all? Do I test only one? That's a question. To get that, then I call cell renderers, pass in the params, and get my result. So it takes a little bit to get to it. The more important issue is that the result of this call doesn't rely only on params. It also relies on the language, and that is not something that I pass in. So when I write this test, I'm going to have to preset my component with those languages so that I have that information there. I'm going to be relying on a side effect. That's not ideal. A much better thing to do for testing is to have a pure function where everything that you're testing in your function is passed into it directly. You're not relying on anything being set. automatically by something else, magically by something else. You want it so that every time you pass in a certain set of inputs to your function, you get a reliable expected output from it. That is a pure function, and that is much easier to test. So the first approach to get to that point is simply to extract these 3 lines of code to a function. And that's what I've done in this version. So if for Matthew, we get our params in, and then we extract this out. If we go look at cell renderer, it's defined down here. It is a function that takes those 2 arguments and does everything that we need. This is an extremely testable function because it doesn't have any side effects. There's nothing else that we need to do. There will be no surprises when it returns a value. So this is much better, in my opinion, than what we started out with. Still want to get a little bit further. I'd like to extract this. This is a function. I don't need to define it here with a closure directly. I can extract that out to a function. So I'm calling that one cell renderer. So I can have a function where I pass in the languages and it returns a function of the type that AGGrid expects. AGGrid expects a function that takes params and returns a string. Well, I can create a closure around that function where passing in the thing that I want and then have params operate on it. This works pretty well, and it looks fairly clean here. What I don't like about it is that we end up with yet another thing to test. Now I have 2 different functions to test. The true thing that I'm testing, the cell renderer call with the pure function, and then this other thing that I'm testing that the closure works correctly. Is there a way to do that automatically? Well, yeah, there is. What I'm doing here with this code, where I'm converting a function that takes 2 arguments to a function that only has to take 1 of those arguments, is a process that is known in functional programming as partial application. I am converting a 2-argument function to a 1-argument function by partially giving it 1 of its arguments. It's a nice feature, and fortunately, libraries give us that. One library in particular that has it is Lodash. It's a library I like. It gives us this function that will let us partially apply onto cell renderer the languages. So it will convert the cell renderer function, which takes 2 arguments, to a function that takes 1 argument, that just takes the thing that it is not passed. So it's essentially the same code as this one, but I don't have to write that code. I don't have to write the test for it. And this is a lot more flexible. Partial has a whole bunch of things it can do besides just this. So I advise trying to use partial in order to simplify this. So when we pull all these things together, this is our final version. The row data isn't any different than what we had seen a couple versions ago. The first column is the same, but now when we're defining the rest of our column defs, I can use partial application to create the one function that I will use for all of the columns, and then I can just pass that in here for every column, and then it's easy. And I can write a test for this function, and I can use it here, and everything works well, and the users have what they want. So I hope that this works out. I hope that this explains a way to do transposing data from within an AGGrid component. It shows that you can use these renderers, and similarly, it's the exact same processes that you could use for editors and value handlers and everything else to have it look like you're defining things on the row basis when you're really defining them on the column, because that's the only thing AGGrid gives us. So thank you. Good luck.